The city of Eclipsis was a place where noise ruled. The streets buzzed with the cacophony of hurried footsteps, honking cars, and the endless chatter of people trying to outshout one another. It was a city that thrived on chaos, where the loudest voices always won, and the quiet ones were trampled underfoot. But in the shadows of this deafening world, a new kind of power was brewing, a power that would soon silence everything. Her name was Vera Noctis, though no one knew it yet. To the world, she was just another face in the crowd, another voice drowned out by the noise. But Vera had learned the hard way that silence was not weakness. It was a weapon, and she was about to wield it like no one ever had before. Vera wasn't always silent. Once, she had been loud, too loud. She had been the kind of person who wore her heart on her sleeve, who believed that if she just screamed loud enough, someone would hear her. She had trusted too easily, given too much, and fought too hard for people who didn't deserve it. And every time, they had taken her words, her emotions, her energy, and twisted them into something ugly. It started with her family. Her father, a man who thrived on control, had always demanded her obedience. "Speak when spoken to," he would say, his voice cold and unyielding. But Vera had refused to stay quiet. She had argued, pleaded, and screamed for him to see her, to hear her, to understand her. And every time, he had shut her down with a single, dismissive glance. "You're too emotional," he would say. "No one will ever take you seriously if you can't control yourself." Then came her friends, or rather, the people she had thought were her friends. They had taken her kindness for granted, her loyalty for weakness. They had laughed at her when she stood up for herself, mocked her when she tried to set boundaries. "You're too sensitive," they would say. "Can't you take a joke?" And Vera, desperate to be accepted, had swallowed her pride and laughed along with them, even as their words cut deeper and deeper. But the final blow came from the man she had loved. He had been charming, magnetic, the kind of person who could make you feel like the center of the world, until he decided you weren't. He had manipulated her, gaslit her, and made her doubt her own reality. And when she had finally found the courage to confront him, he had looked her in the eye and said, "You're too much. No one will ever love you if you keep acting like this." That was the moment Vera broke. She had given everything, her words, her emotions, her time, to people who had taken and taken until there was nothing left. And for what? To be told she was too loud, too emotional, too much? To be treated like a puppet, dancing to someone else's tune? No more. The change didn't happen overnight. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Vera stopped arguing with her father. She stopped trying to explain herself to her friends. She stopped begging for love from someone who would never give it. At first, they didn't notice. They were too busy talking, too busy demanding, too busy taking. But slowly, they began to realize that something was different. Her father was the first to feel it. He had always relied on her reactions, her tears, her anger, her pleas, to feed his sense of control. But now, when he yelled, she simply stood there, silent and unmoving. When he demanded an explanation, she gave him nothing but a cold, empty stare. It unnerved him, though he would never admit it. "What's wrong with you?" he would snap. "Why won't you say anything?" But Vera just smiled, a small, knowing smile that made his blood run cold. Her friends noticed next. They had always counted on her to be the peacemaker, the one who would smooth things over when tensions ran high. But now, when they tried to provoke her, She simply walked away. When they mocked her, she didn't laugh along. She didn't cry. She didn't react at all. And it drove them crazy. "What's your problem?" they would ask, their voices tinged with frustration. "Why are you being so weird?" But Vera just shrugged, her silence speaking louder than any words ever could. And then there was him, the man who had broken her. He had always fed off her emotions, her reactions, her pain. But now, when he tried to manipulate her, she gave him nothing. No tears, no anger, no explanations, just silence. It infuriated him. "Say something," he would shout, his voice trembling with rage. "You can't just ignore me." But Vera just looked at him, her eyes cold and unreadable, until he couldn't take it anymore and stormed away. It was in those moments that Vera realized the true power of silence. It wasn't just about keeping her mouth shut. It was about taking back her power. It was about refusing to let anyone else dictate how she felt, how she acted, how she reacted. And the more she embraced it, the more she saw how much it terrified people. Because silence was a mirror. It forced people to confront their own insecurities, their own flaws, their own weaknesses. And most people couldn't handle that. They would rather keep her talking, keep her distracted, keep her focused on their nonsense, so they didn't have to deal with their own demons. But Vera wasn't playing their game anymore. She had learned that silence was strength. Silence was power. Silence was the ultimate weapon, and she was just getting started. As the days turned into weeks, Vera began to test the limits of her newfound power. She started small, using her silence to unsettle those who had wronged her. But soon, she realized that her influence could extend far beyond her personal life. The city of Eclipsis was a place where noise ruled, where the loudest voices always won. But what would happen if someone dared to be silent? What would happen if someone refused to play by the rules? Vera was about to find out. She began to observe the people around her, the politicians who lied through their teeth, the businessmen who exploited the weak, the influencers who thrived on trauma and attention. They were all the same, feeding off the noise, the chaos, the reactions of others. And Vera knew exactly how to take them down. She started with a local politician, a man who had built his career on empty promises and loud speeches. At one of his rallies, Vera stood in the front row, her eyes locked on his. As he ranted and raved, trying to provoke a reaction from the crowd, she remained completely still, completely silent. At first, he didn't notice her, but as the minutes passed, he began to falter. His words grew less confident, his gestures less forceful. He kept glancing at her, as if waiting for her to cheer, to boo, to do something. But she just stood there, silent and unmoving, until he finally stumbled over his words and cut his speech short. The crowd erupted into murmurs, confused by the sudden shift in energy. But Vera just smiled, small, knowing smile, and walked away. That was the beginning. From there, Vera's influence began to spread. She targeted the powerful, the corrupt, the manipulative, using her silence to unravel them one by one. And as she did, she began to realize something. The world wasn't ready for someone like her. The world thrived on noise, on chaos, on reaction. And silence? Silence was the one thing they couldn't handle. But Vera wasn't just going to unsettle them. She was going to destroy them. And she was going to do it without saying a single word. The city of Eclipsis was beginning to change. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shift in the air, a quiet unease that crept into the corners of people's minds. The noise was still there. The chaos still reigned. But something, or someone, was disrupting the balance. And at the center of it all was Vera Noctis, the woman who had learned to wield silence like a blade. Word of her began to spread, though no one could quite explain what she was or what she did. She wasn't a vigilante, not in the traditional sense. She didn't fight with fists or weapons. She didn't shout or protest or demand justice. She simply existed, and her existence was enough to unravel the most powerful people in the city. Vera's next target was Marcus Vane, a billionaire tech mogul who had built his empire on the backs of others. Marcus was the kind of man who thrived on attention, who loved nothing more than the sound of his own voice. He was a master manipulator, using his charm and charisma to bend people to his will. But Vera saw through him. She saw the insecurity beneath the bravado, the fear beneath the arrogance, and she knew exactly how to break him. She attended one of his lavish charity galas, blending into the crowd like a shadow. Marcus was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by sycophants and admirers. He was in his element, basking in the glow of their attention. But when his eyes landed on Vera, something shifted. She wasn't fawning over him like the others. She wasn't laughing at his jokes or hanging on his every word. She was just watching, silent, unreadable. At first, Marcus tried to ignore her. He continued his performance, his voice growing louder, his gestures more exaggerated, as if trying to drown out her presence. But the more he tried, the more he faltered. His jokes fell flat. His stories lost their punchlines. He kept glancing at her, waiting for her to react, to give him something, anything to work with. But she gave him nothing. By the end of the night, Marcus was a wreck. His confidence was shattered, his charm replaced by a nervous, jittery energy. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew one thing. Vera Noctis had gotten under his skin, and she hadn't even said a word. Vera's influence didn't stop there. She began to target others: corrupt politicians, abusive bosses, toxic influencers. She would show up at their events, their meetings, their public appearances, and simply stand there, silent and unmoving. And every time, the result was the same. They would start off confident, even arrogant, but as the minutes passed, they would begin to unravel. Their words would falter, their masks would slip, and by the end, they would be left exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. The media began to take notice. They called her the Silent Shadow, a mysterious figure who seemed to appear out of nowhere and leave chaos in her wake. They speculated about who she was, what she wanted, and how she managed to destabilize some of the most powerful people in the city. But no one could find any answers. Vera left no traces, no clues, no evidence of her existence. She was a ghost, a whisper, a void. And the more the media talked about her, the more people began to fear her. Because Vera wasn't just targeting the powerful, she was exposing them. She was forcing the city to confront the corruption, the manipulation, the exploitation that had been hiding in plain sight. And in doing so, she was holding up a mirror to society itself. But not everyone was afraid of Vera. Some saw her as a hero, a symbol of resistance against the forces that had oppressed them for so long. They began to emulate her, adopting her silence as their own form of protest. At first, it was just a few individuals. A woman who refused to engage with her abusive partner. A man who stood silently in front of his exploitative boss. a teenager who stopped responding to the bullies at school. But soon, it became a movement. The Silent Rebellion, they called it. It spread like wildfire, fueled by the stories of those who had been inspired by Vera's actions. People began to realize that they didn't have to shout to be heard, that they didn't have to fight to win. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was say nothing at all. But not everyone was happy about the Silent Rebellion. The powerful, the corrupt, the manipulative. They saw it as a threat, and they were determined to stop it. One night, Vera received a message. It was unsigned, but she knew who it was from. The message was simple. "We need to talk." Attached was an address. A secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city. Vera knew it was a trap, but she went anyway. She wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose. The mansion belonged to Evelyn Graves, a media mogul who had built her empire on scandal and sensationalism. Evelyn was one of the most powerful people in the city, and she had been watching Vera's rise with growing unease. She had tried to ignore her at first, dismissing her as a passing trend. But as the Silent Rebellion grew, Evelyn realized that Vera was more than just a nuisance. She was a threat, and Evelyn was determined to eliminate her. When Vera arrived, she was greeted by a team of armed guards. They escorted her to a lavish study where Evelyn was waiting. The room was filled with screens, each one displaying a different news channel. Evelyn was sitting in a high-backed chair, her eyes fixed on Vera as she entered. "So," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you're the famous Silent Shadow? I have to admit, I expected more." Vera didn't respond. She just stood there, silent and unmoving. Her eyes locked on Evelyn's. Evelyn's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can just show up, say nothing, and destroy everything I've built? Well, let me tell you something, little girl. You're not the first person to try to take me down, and you won't be the last." Still, Vera said nothing. She just watched, her expression calm and unreadable. Evelyn's patience began to wear thin. "Say something," she snapped, her voice rising. "Why won't you say anything?" But Vera just smiled. A small, knowing smile that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Evelyn Graves was not a woman accustomed to losing control. For decades, she had been the puppet master of Eclipsis, pulling the strings of media, politics, and public opinion. But now, standing in her opulent study, face to face with Vera Noctis, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: fear. Vera's silence was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of submission or fear. It was the silence of power. It was the kind of silence that made you question everything you thought you knew, and Evelyn hated it. "You think you're so clever?" Evelyn spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You think your little act of silence makes you powerful? Let me tell you something, girl. Power isn't about what you don't say. It's about what you do. And you're doing nothing." Vera didn't flinch. She didn't react. She just stood there, her eyes locked on Evelyn's, her expression calm and unreadable. And the longer she stood there, the more Evelyn unraveled. "Say something," Evelyn screamed, slamming her fist on the desk. "Why won't you say anything?" But Vera just smiled. A small, knowing smile that made Evelyn's blood boil. Evelyn wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Across the city, the powerful and corrupt were beginning to crack under the weight of Vera's silence. Politicians who had once thrived on empty promises and loud speeches found themselves stumbling over their words. their confidence shattered. Businessmen who had built their empires on exploitation and manipulation were suddenly exposed, their carefully constructed facades crumbling, and influencers who had once reveled in drama and attention were now scrambling to stay relevant in a world that was beginning to see through their lies. The silent rebellion was growing. What had started as a few individuals standing up to their oppressors had become a citywide movement. People were beginning to realize that they didn't have to shout to be heard, that they didn't have to fight to win. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was say nothing at all. But the powerful weren't going down without a fight. They banded together, determined to crush the silent rebellion and eliminate Vera Noctis once and for all. They launched a smear campaign, painting Vera as a dangerous extremist, a terrorist who sought to destroy the fabric of society. They used their influence to turn the public against her, to make her out to be the villain. But Vera wasn't afraid. She knew the truth, and she knew that the more they tried to silence her, the louder her silence would become. The final showdown came on a cold, moonless night. The city of Eclipsis was on edge, its streets eerily quiet. The powerful had called a meeting, a gathering of the city's elite, to discuss how to deal with the silent rebellion. They had chosen a secluded location, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and armed guards. They thought they were safe. They thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Vera arrived unannounced, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. The guards didn't see her coming. One by one, they fell, not to violence, but to the sheer weight of her presence. She didn't need to fight them. She just needed to be there, silent and unmoving, until they were too unnerved to stand in her way. When she entered the meeting room, the atmosphere shifted. The room was filled with the city's most powerful people, politicians, businessmen, media moguls, all gathered to discuss how to stop her. But when she walked in, they fell silent. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. "How did you get in here?" one of them demanded, his voice shaking. Vera didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every face, every expression. And the longer she stood there, the more they unraveled. "Say something," another shouted, his voice rising in panic. "Why won't you say anything?" But Vera just smiled, a small, knowing smile that made their blood run cold. One by one, they began to crack. The politician, who had built his career on lies, found himself unable to speak, his words caught in his throat. The businessman, who had exploited countless workers, began to tremble, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The media mogul, who had manipulated public opinion for years, broke down in tears, her carefully constructed facade crumbling to dust. And through it all, Vera stood there, silent and unmoving, her presence a constant reminder of the power they had tried so hard to suppress. When it was over, the room was in shambles. The powerful were broken, their confidence shattered, their masks stripped away. And Vera? She was still standing, calm and unbothered, her silence speaking louder than any words ever could. The next morning, the city woke up to a new reality. The powerful were gone, their empires crumbling in their absence. The media was in chaos, scrambling to make sense of what had happened. And the people? They were free. The silent rebellion had won. But it wasn't just a victory over the powerful. It was a victory over noise, over chaos, over the endless cycle of manipulation and exploitation. It was a victory for silence, for stillness, for the power of saying nothing at all. As for Vera, she disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. No one knew where she went or what she did next. Some said she left the city, seeking a new place to spread her message. Others said she stayed, watching from the shadows, ready to strike again if the noise ever returned. But one thing was certain: Vera Noctis had changed the world, and she had done it without saying a single word. In the end, the city of Eclipsis learned a valuable lesson. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence wasn't surrender. Silence was strength. Silence was power. And in a world that thrived on noise, silence was the ultimate weapon. And so, the legend of Vera Noctis, the silent shadow, lived on, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was say nothing at all.